Greetings. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, and the West Mineral Church in West Mineral, Kansas. Today we're going to be looking at something since Valentine's Day is coming up pretty soon. We kind of thought this fit with the topic of that coming along, and it's about the story of Ruth from the Old Testament. And I thought that kind of fits a little bit with that in mind. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. Well, there was a couple one time, and they'd been married for quite a few years, 50-some years. And the wife one day went to the husband and said, why don't you ever tell me that you love me? He said, I told you I loved you the day that we got married, and if I ever change my mind, you'll be the first to know. Well, probably not a good idea. Probably not a good thing for someone to say. Also, there was a couple that were driving down the road, and this is back, the days when you still had bench seats in the car. And they came up behind another couple, the young couple that was in a car in front of them, and this young couple was sitting right next to each other. And the wife says to the husband, why don't we sit close together like that anymore? And he said, I haven't moved. Okay. So, anyway, I want to kind of give a Reader's Digest version of the story of Ruth. It's really not a very long story anyway, but still. There's a man from Israel decides to leave during the time of drought and live in the land of Moab. He takes his wife and his 2 sons with him, and they end up getting married to Moabite women. Eventually, the man dies, and both his sons die, and they have no children. Naomi decides to return to Israel, and the 2 daughter-in-laws, one says, stays, but as she's going back, she decides to go back to Israel, and Ruth says to her, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. So Ruth goes back to Israel with Naomi. But how are they going to survive? Well, there isn't much to do in those days, and so other than to glean the fields, and it's harvest time. So Ruth goes out to glean the field, the grain that is left behind by the people that are harvesting the crop. And it just happens to be owned by a man named Boaz, owns this field. And he notices Ruth, and he kind of gives her special treatment. He tells the workers, drop a few extra heads of grain on the ground, so she can pick them up. So, and he lets her come in, and when it's time to take a break, kind of lets her go ahead and, have water that the workers are doing. Kind of treats her special. Well, she comes back home, and Naomi says, she's got a pretty good amount of grain. And she said, how is it that you got so much grain? She says, well, she tells her about this man named Boaz. He says, oh, he's a relative of ours, of her husband's. And there's a thing called a kinsman redeemer, that the closest remaining relative of a man that has died, if his brother, doesn't there, is to take this woman on, take on responsibility for her, even marry her. Well, so this Boaz is a close relative, and through one thing and another, Ruth kind of they try to kind of manipulate things a little bit, but kind of goes at night to where Boaz is sleeping and sits down beside him and tells him, "You can be my kinsman redeemer." He says, "Well, there's actually somebody, a relative that's closer than I am, but I'll tell you what, I'll see if he wants to be that person. But if he won't, I will." And of course, he goes and the other person declines the offer, and Boaz becomes a kinsman redeemer. He and Ruth get married, and they have a child together. So, one thing leads to another. That's the Reader's Digest version of the whole story. It's more involved than that. But anyway, here lately, I've got all kinds of channels I can watch on TV, and but really, I have a hard time finding anything, especially the newer stuff, newer network TV, especially that I'm really interested in watching. A while back, I found it kind of like the old Gunsmoke TV show. I could see that, and so watched it, and I got to thinking, this story of Ruth would have worked out pretty good as a episode of Gunsmoke. Here you could have a man that is a farmer, rancher, there around Dodge City, that things aren't going too well, so he takes off and he goes off, we'll say, to Colorado to try to make things better. And he takes his wife and his sons, and while they're there, the sons marry women that are, we could say, maybe Native American. And but before long, the sons die, and of course the husband dies. So the woman decides to come back to Dodge City because they still have land back in Dodge City. Well, one of the daughter-in-laws, says, "I'll go back with you." And so she goes. And what's she going to do? Well, there's really not a whole lot you can do as a young woman in Dodge City other than work in the saloon, right? So she ends up going to the Long Branch and working for Miss Kitty at the saloon. And it just so happens that, as the farmers and ranchers come by, there just happens to be this one rancher that comes, and he kind of takes a liking to her and treats her special. And, the girls there, they get tips, and he just happens to give her a little more than is customary. And then she goes home, and mother-in-law says, "Well, hey, how come you're doing so well?" "Well, there was this one certain rancher that comes in, and she says, "You know what? He's a relative of my husband's. Treat him special." He could really, of course, as we can say through the story, one thing leads to another, and they get together and they get married. And that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Of course, there's got to be another cowboy involved, and there has to be a fight and possibly a shootout and all that stuff that goes on in the old Gunsmoke show. But eventually they get together and everything works out. Well, that's another possible way of looking at it. Now, just kind of a side note here. There was a lady named Michelle Breeze that appeared on Gunsmoke 33 times from 1964 to 1973. And 32 of those times she was a saloon girl. But one particular episode, she was one of the main characters. And it was kind of a similar situation that I just talked about her and a rancher that's there. So, that's kind of interesting. Well, that's interesting how that all comes about. And so you might not realize that Burt Reynolds got his start partly on being on Gunsmoke, and he was he was a blacksmith but also was considered to be part Native American. So they kind of, what they were doing there is trying to find a way. This is, of course, back in the days when there was a lot of racial tension and everything. And so this was kind of their way of bringing that issue in, see, without creating too much turmoil, but yet showing how there were some people that were prejudiced against Native Americans at that time. And so it kind of shows how that all works together. Well, here in the story of Ruth, she is a foreigner. She's from Moab. She's not she's not Jewish, and yet she is welcome into the family of this Jewish man named Boaz. And the interesting thing is that she also is in the line that later will come along King David. How about that? That this is part of it. Of course, Jesus is of the line of David as well. So Ruth is part of that line that leads up to Jesus and throughout all this stuff. How did that happen? Well, you've got to understand. And why would Boaz be willing to marry a woman who's not Jewish? Well, we have to understand. Boaz is his, I think, grandmother, or maybe it was his mother. I'm not sure. Well, anyway, there was a lady named Rahab. Remember when the people came to Jericho and there were some spies that went into Jericho and they were hidden out, and there was a lady named Rahab that hid the spies, and because of that, she was survived when Jericho was overtaken, and she became, in that line was Boaz from, how about that? So, it all kind of, that's why Boaz would be willing to let that go on like that. Wow. And we might think that first, Boaz is showing kindness to Ruth. He realizes that she was married to his maybe cousin, whatever, and shows her special kindness. But eventually it goes a little bit further and a little bit further, and they eventually become a couple throughout this. Wow. Boaz didn't have to do that. He didn't have to reach out. And of course, we kind of wonder that, there is kind of a little bit of what we might say manipulation in there, where Naomi kind of tells Ruth to go and at night and lay down at his feet. And, well, okay. But still, it all works out. Well, and there, Boaz not only shows kindness to her, but eventually this relationship develops into something more than we might call a friendship, but evidently a romantic relationship eventually comes along. It might be more than just doing his duty as, like say, the kinsman redeemer, but it's actually was attracted to Ruth, and eventually they get married. You see in this story love and devotion. There was love and devotion that Ruth had for Naomi, that she didn't have to come back with her to Israel, but she did. She had love and devotion for her, and love and devotion for Naomi's God. She said, "Your God shall be my God." And so she followed along with that. And coming up here on Valentine's Day before too long, we also see that that's kind of what Valentine's Day, we kind of think of it as a time for people that are more of a romantic love relationship, but it's also love can be shown other ways as well. But then eventually this relationship between Ruth and Boaz develops into something we might say is romantic. And it started out as a kindness. There was this attraction, but it first started out, we might say, almost like a friendship between the two. And a lot of times people, when they're first, that's the first thing that comes along when a relationship starts. It starts out as a friendship. Two people that have things in common, that enjoy each other's company, and they're friends. But, it takes more than friendship for a relationship to really take off. And then there's the romantic aspect of it. Two people are kind of physically attracted to one another because of various different reasons. It could be the way they look or the way they act, the things that they do. But something about it, there is this romantic type. Uh, and there's a Greek word, the Greek word for friendship is phileo, and that's what starts out. And then there's another Greek word called eros, where we get the word erotic. And that's the attraction. That's the physical attraction that someone has for, or maybe even an emotional attraction that a person has for someone else. But, in order for a relationship to really grow and be special, it needs more than just friendship. It needs more than just that physical or emotional attraction. And then there's another Greek word called agape. Agape means unconditional love. And a lot of times that's what really needs to be there. As a love that says, I may not necessarily like what you're doing right at the moment, or the way you act right at the moment, or the way you might look at the moment, or the way I might feel about you at this particular moment. But there's still this love there, this unconditional love that somebody can have for someone else. Agape. It's the kind of love that God has for us. We can't perfectly do it the way that God does, but this is the idea. And for a relationship to work out, there needs to be this unconditional love. That I love you in spite of the way you make me feel right now, in spite of the way you might look right now, or might be acting right now. I still love you. And that's the love that makes a relationship last throughout the years and stand the test of time. Well, that's the love that Jesus told us, this is my commandment, that you love one another. And hopefully this is the kind of love that we can have, this unconditional love, this agape, so that that can go out into the world and that people can have that love for one another. Well, thank you all for coming. Hope this may have been a blessing to you, and we continue to allow this to work in our lives, knowing that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.